Perhaps a look, perhaps a lie, or something taken out of time. It all starts with something little. Are we stupid, are we blind? Maybe you shout, maybe you swear. It goes too far, we're not aware.
I'm going to talk mainly about austerity at the beginning, and then a bit about Scotland's economy, different strengths in Scotland's economy, and touch on a few other subjects along the way. So it's fairly broad range, and hopefully it hits on a lot of the things that are interesting people just now. So yeah, as I say, a wee bit about where we are post-referendum and how things kind of look from a political point of view in the broadest sense. Going to talk about austerity, touch on the banks, I know that was mentioned, alternatives to austerity, what Scotland contributes to the UK, where things are going to go, Westminster and Holyrood potentially, and then a bit about Scotland's economy. So quite broad ranging, and we'll see how it goes. So, a bit about me. I've been working in manufacturing since I graduated from Strathclyde, which is now 30 years ago and counting. The last 10 years running my own businesses, and I'm doing stuff internationally. I've worked all over the place in the last number of years, including periods in some Scandinavian countries, which really opened my eyes as to what a successful small European independent country could look like. When the referendum came along, I kind of got involved in stuff and got sucked in and ended up doing World Tour of Scotland over about a year, which took me to about 85 different venues, which was wonderful. Saw some tremendous places all the way from Orkney in the middle of the summer, which you can't beat, Skye, Islay, some fabulous parts of the country. So I did that, and then I then got involved in the Commonweal with Robin McAlpine post the referendum. So I've been working with them and getting involved in a few other political things since then as well. So I'm not an economist. I come at it from a very practical, if this was my business point of view, what does it look like? And go and check the numbers in a bit of detail. So hopefully it's something that you can relate to. So in terms of where we are, clearly the referendum ended up with a no vote, which means we're in the Union, right? A lot of people forget that. They say, why are these Scots coming down here and telling us what to do? Well, it's because there was a no vote. If there'd been a yes vote, we'd be off doing something different. As David Cameron said, we're an equal partner in that family of nations. And the Scottish representation, via SNP or whatever, from a pro-independence point of view in Westminster, will be there to play a constructive role in running the UK, because frankly we're part of it and we're going to make the most of it while we're there. And people forget Scotland needs a strong UK, whether we're part of it or not part of it. It's going to be our biggest trading partner, and it's important that the UK, or our UK in the future potentially, is successful. And that's an important point to get across. I think it's not, sometimes it's looked upon as a destructive element, all these tartan hordes going down south. The reality is quite the opposite. We need to make it work. And I want to talk about some of the stuff that alternatives to austerity, where there is a very coherent programme, which is frankly what I think the UK in its entirety needs. So when you talk about austerity, it's one of these words that gets thrown about, and people talk about it all the time, and everybody hates it, right? And you say, well, what is it? Describe it to me. And it kind of works at two levels when you dig into it. There's a lot of people say, well, it's the cuts and I don't like the cuts. And that's absolutely fair enough, because it's destruction of public services, it's tax on the vulnerable, it's all of that stuff which we're instinctively repelled by. But clearly there's a lot more to it than that from an economic point of view, which is mainly what I'm going to touch on tonight, but I'm going to look at it from both points of view. Because the whole austerity thing rests on an economic theory that frankly was debunked decades ago, but keeps rearing its ugly head again. And I'll kind of talk you through that in a bit of, deconstruct that in a bit of detail. It comes back to this kind of balancing the budget as it's described, and it ignores the need in an economy for growth, which is back to the Keynesian thing, which I did a year of economics at university back in the 80s, and at that point it was kind of like Keynes had debunked all this nonsense back in the 30s and the 40s, but it keeps coming back, and I'll go through that in a bit of detail. Talk about everybody's favourite politician. Mrs. Thatcher said this back in the 70s or the 80s. Any woman that understands the problems of running a home will be nearer to understanding the problems of running a country, which is one of the most ridiculous pieces of nonsense anybody's ever said. But yeah, that was where she was coming from at the time. Because if you look at a household, your own personal finances, the way it works is you've got money coming in, you've got money going out, and you've got what you've got left or not got left, depending on how much you spend. And you might have debt or not, or you might have some money in the bank or not. And that's kind of the way it works. It's kind of a straightforward, linear thing. When you're running an economy, it's completely different. And it's completely different because there's this loop here, this feedback loop, because a lot of the expenditure ends up coming back in as income. And I'll kind of talk you through how that works and explain what that process is all about. And that's the fundamental difference that they kind of forget when they're talking about you've got to balance the books, you've got to run it like it was a household. Because basically what happens is if you've got an economy, a national economy, and you put money into that through investment, and that can be through infrastructure, roads, house building, a whole range of stuff, which we'll talk about more as we go through. What that does is that leads to more people getting employed. And more people getting employed means there's less people on benefits, and there's more people paying taxes, and that means there's more people that have got money to spend in the economy in the corner shops, which means that they're employing more people and more businesses are opening, which means there's more people with money and more people with spending money, and they're spending more money, which means more people are getting employed, etc, etc, etc. So you get into that virtuous circle, if you like, where the economy is growing and things are healthy, as opposed to where we've been for most of the past 5 or 6 years, which is the opposite, where we're cutting and get into more of a spiral, and I'll show you some of the numbers on that as we go through. So that's the fundamental concept. It's kind of straightforward. Clearly there's other stuff round about it in terms of how fast you grow, how much investment you put in, where you direct that investment to, and a whole range of things that need to be managed effectively to make it work. But conceptually, that's a fundamental basis of the whole thing. So let's have a few graphs now on some data round about. Everybody can see the stuff okay, yeah. On what has happened over the past few years. I call it George Osborne's record. It's really the tail end of Alistair Darling going into what George Osborne has done. Because if you remember when the Tories came in 2010, the first budget in June 2010, they laid out a bunch of economic plans for the recovery and talked about the way those numbers would pan out. So what I've done is taken that set of numbers and compared them as to what actually happened over the 5 years. So they talked about a deficit reduction plan, which was to get rid of the deficit, the current account deficit by 2015-16, and the deficit in its entirety by the following year. So by the end of the Parliament, they wanted to get basically rid of the deficit. So basically what that means is deficit, except for the investment part of it, which was about 20 billion, would go to zero. And that's that blue line there. The reality is they've missed that, and missed that by quite a long way. Missed it by about 50 billion per year. Which at the headline, it's like, okay, a politician makes promises and they miss their promises, no big surprise there. But the interesting part is why they've missed it, which I'm going to go and talk to in a minute. Before we forget about the difference between the deficit and the debt, the deficit is the amount, the difference between what your income and your expenditure in any given year. The debt is accumulation of all the deficits. So the fact that we've still got a positive deficit, we're spending more than we're earning, means that the debt continues to go up. So the fact that the deficit's coming down doesn't mean that the debt isn't still obviously going up. So there's two parts to it. Let's look at spend. The spend lines are almost identical. What he said 5 years ago he was going to do in terms of cutting investment, cutting public services, is pretty much what they've delivered. In actual fact, they've cut slightly more than they said they were going to do. So that part of it achieved his plan. That line's kind of going up, but you've got to remember we've got inflation over that period, etc., etc. When you put it as a percentage of the economy, spend's going down. So the amount of money that's getting spent on public services and investment over that 5-year period in terms of the whole economy as a percentage has been going down, and that's where the cuts, as we see them, have been taking place. So if you hit spend numbers, what's going on? Missed the deficit target, debt's still going up, spending cuts as he planned for them, delivered, but keeps missing the deficit target. But the reason is because they missed their income target, okay? And this is where it gets interesting. The blue line is the plan for national income, which is all your tax income. And the red line is the actual. So there's quite a gap there, and that's the reason why the deficit hasn't come down as much as they thought. And if you think about it, the bits they can control, in terms of how much they're spending, they've done what they said they're going to do. The bit they didn't control, don't control, how much tax people are paying, is the bit they've missed. And then you dig a wee bit deeper into that, and it's a very complicated graph because I stole it from somebody else. But you only want to look at two lines, the yellow line at the top and the green line at the bottom, and ignore all the stuff in the middle. And just to explain what this is a graph that shows the percentage of the total income of individuals, how much of it gets taken in income tax and national insurance. So if you think about it, people that are below the minimum tax threshold don't pay any tax. People above that are paying 20%, plus they're paying national insurance, and as you go higher up, you're paying 40%, 45%. So there's a whole range, mixture of what income tax rates individuals are paying. This is a number that basically takes total income of everybody in the country and divides it by the total tax take, income tax plus national insurance. So it's effectively the average tax rate everybody in the country is paying, combined tax and national insurance. And if you look at that, it was 34% back in 2009-10 when they took over. And the projection was it would go up, the percentage would go up. They'd be taking a bigger percentage of tax from people as time went on. Not because they put tax rates up, but because on average people would earn more and move up the tax bands. Because that's what's always happened in the past. People have gone through their careers, have earned more money, wages have gone up in general, people have moved up, people that were 20% before moved up to 40%, and the average number goes up. But the reality is it's actually going the other way, it's going down. So what does that mean? That means that rather than people earning more and paying more tax, over that period of time people have been earning less and paying less tax. And that is effectively where the income gaps come from. Because the whole problem with the austerity model is that you're not investing in the economy, people aren't working, the people that are working are earning less and they're paying less tax, and that's where the gaps come from. So it kind of shows up in stark terms a fundamental flaw in the whole process. Another interesting thing to look at is the amount of that public spending it's investment, because investment's important, because if you invest in infrastructure, which is what most of that is, that's where you generate a lot of jobs very quickly. People building houses, building roads, building bridges, building railways, building whatever. You put the money in, you get a lot of jobs, and often a lot of more technical jobs, potentially higher paid jobs, depending on what the project is. And that investment number's been slashed, which has had a major impact on the amount of activity in the economy over that period. So if you think back to the model at the start, the model basically says you've got your income, you've got your expenditure, a lot of your expenditure comes back into the economy as income, and investment's a key part of that. So what's happened, they've cut the spending, the consequences of that has been that income has been cut as well because of what's happened, and they also slashed the investment, which has been a bit of a disaster. So that's kind of where we're at. Now I said at the start there's two parts to austerity. It's about the economy and the numbers and the graphs, but it's also about the other side of that, which is the effect on individuals. 400% increase in use of Scottish food banks last year, according to the Trussell Trust. So investment is good for growth, good for fixing the economy, but it's also important for individuals. And they talk about trickle down, whereas the theory, if you give a lot of money to a few people at the top, eventually a lot of that will trickle down to people at the bottom. In actual fact, the way the model works best is trickle up. If you give people the money at the bottom, it gradually trickles up to the people at the top, because people at the bottom are going to spend more money if they've got the money, whereas people that have got a lot of money tend to save it or spend it on things, items which are either imported or don't have a big effect on your local economy. So that's quite an important point as well. In terms of the banks, forget the food banks, talk about the banks. The UK government put a total of 500 billion into the banks in 2008, which shows where the priorities were. So it was all about protecting bankers. And it was a mixture of loans, guarantees, equity. They bought some banks. But it's an important point as well that came up quite a lot in the referendum. The US government actually put more money into the UK banks than the UK government did. They put in about $1 trillion, which just shows you how interconnected and globalised the World Bank system is. So moving back to austerity, there's a nice wee quote there. Nicola talking about this. Austerity's failed. You need an alternative that promotes growth and fairness. So again, it's those two parts to this. An economic model that makes sense, but also something that supports social cohesion. And the whole thing ties together, because I said, if you're putting the money into the hands of the people that need the money most, it's got a much more impact on economic growth than doing it the other way around. The economic proposal that's been talked about, which has been floated over the last few weeks, and this is kind of part of the SNP's bargaining kit, if you like, when they go to Westminster after the election. As I said at the beginning, we're in the UK, we're here. If we're going to be represented at Westminster, we've got as much right to put our point of view forward in terms of where we think UK economic policy should be going as anybody else does. And that's the headline of the proposal that's been talked about, which is around about a 0.5% increase in annual spending, which sounds a small number. That adds up to about 180 billion extra spending over the 5 years, which sounds like a big number. But if you actually look at what it means we're effectively, in real terms, taking investment back to where it was pre-crash. So that's all we're doing. The economic model actually says you're supposed to invest more. The Keynesian model, you're supposed to invest more when things are bad, and you can afford to invest less when things are good, because when things are good, the economy's ticking along quite nicely, thank you. It's when you hit the downturn, you need to get the thing kick-started with some extra investment. So those numbers of themselves aren't ridiculous numbers in any way, shape or form. So I'll show you the Scottish Government's record on investment. This is taken 2008 as the baseline. What's happened to the respective investment the Scottish Government's been compared to the UK Government. Both have come down. The Scottish Government are a victim of the funding from Westminster because they're not allowed to borrow any money to invest, which is typically how you would do investment. But even in that sense, coming down a lot less fast than the extent to which the UK Government has slashed UK-wide investment. So in terms of the Scottish Government, more investment, more employment, less unemployment. Scottish growth is actually slightly above the UK average over the last couple of years, and doing all of that while balancing the budget in the Scottish context, because I said they're not allowed to borrow money, the Scottish Government, and that's with the limited powers that are there, which kind of begs the question, if we had more powers, what else could we do? And a lot of that comes down to not just economic policy, but the inherent coherence of a country of 5 million people, and its ability to react quicker to downturns, take advantage of opportunities quicker, and have a more coherent society and a more coherent economy. And I'll talk a wee bit about some Scandinavian countries later and give examples of that. And you talk about the UK parties, and I kind of lump them all together. The reality is that they're all much of a muchness. If you look at the track record there, clearly the Liberals been in bed with the Tories, part of this austerity cost-cutting exercise over the last 5 years, trying to backpedal from it politically as the election approaches, but I think their goose is well and truly cooked on that one. Labour Party, let's not forget, voted with the coalition for an extra 30 billion cuts just in the last month or so and signed up to the Tory kind of framework around about economic plans for the next Parliament. Because they're victims of what you call triangulation, which is this horrible political word whereby they figure out where the centre ground is and they figure out where their opponents are and they try to position themselves as close to their opponents as they can, but just on the side of where they think the centre ground is. So at a UK-wide level, there's no votes for Labour and being significantly further to the left or significantly less in favour of austerity than the Tories are, because as long as they can kind of hug the Tories and be just one step away from them, they're going to pick up the centre ground. And that's been the whole philosophy from a political point of view. And it works great in the south of England and the Midlands to some extent, where most of the votes are. But of course in Scotland, where there are alternatives, they've been caught short and found out for where they've positioned themselves politically. Something they didn't think would be a problem for them, but clearly in the political environment over the last few months, it's kind of, a lot of these calculations have changed. So that kind of explains where the UK parties are, and more importantly, why they are where they are, and that's not going to change in a hurry. Okay, so you recognise this guy. This is the guy that turns up at your party with one can of special brew and wants to come in and drink all your finest malts. Your classic gate crasher. So, and that's the kind of view we've got in certain quarters of what Scottish politicians going to Westminster is all about. But the reality is we contribute more than our fair share to the UK coffers in terms of income and in terms of exports, and we've got every right to play our full role in determining UK economic policy as an equal member of the family of nations in this United Kingdom of ours, as David Cameron put it. So we shouldn't feel bad about going down there and staking out what we think UK economic policy should be, and we shouldn't feel bad about making it an influence on the next UK government to drag them in a direction that makes sense for Scotland and for the UK as a whole. Scotland's GDP, gross domestic product, it varies year to year, but on average about 15% higher than the UK average. That's the amount of economic activity within Scotland. Scotland's GDP per person, excluding oil, is about the same as the UK average. So when we talk about oil, it's very much the bonus. It's something we've got that we can use to invest for the future. It's not an essential part of our economy, and what it does do is it lifts Scotland in terms of the economic activity, GDP, higher up the league table than the UK average. Higher tax revenue per person than the UK average, and I'll show you the graphs in that in a minute. And also a positive balance of payments. Balance of payments, the difference between what you import and what you export, which I'm going to talk about as well. Scotland contributes more than 40 billion to UK exports per year. 28 billion of that, interestingly, is from non-oil sectors, food and drink, chemicals, petrochemicals, manufactured items to some extent, and a whole range of other sectors I'm going to talk about later. I'm going to quickly whiz through some stuff just to show Scotland's economic strength vis-a-vis the rest of the UK. This is a graph that shows tax revenue per person over the last 30 years since they started collecting data. Scotland's numbers are the higher line, and the UK's numbers are the average is the lower line, the lower bar. Every one of the last 34 years now, Scotland has generated more tax per person. That's the combined income tax, corporation tax, VAT, all added together per head of population than the UK average. Offshore clearly is a part of that, but as I said, that's very much the bonus. Even without that, we've got a strong economy. But in terms of the amount that we put into the UK, it's significant, and as I say, it's more per person than the UK average. That's the map. If you haven't seen these before, it's worth just going through them. That's the map of GDP per part of the UK. The darker the colour, the more economic activity, the more wealth is generated in that part of the UK. As you would expect in the south of England, quite a lot of economic strength, a lot of rich areas generating economic activity. A wee bit round about the Manchester area in the northwest. Northeast of Scotland, clearly one of the areas of highest economic activity, and across the central belt as well of Scotland, significantly so. So that's the parts of the UK that generate the wealth, if you like, for the country. That's the UK Office of National Statistics graph map of where the richest households in the UK are. The darker the colour, the higher percentage of rich households. South of England, more than 13% are classed as being what they call rich households, which their definition is a household that's got assets of more than £1 million, including your house, your shares, your cars, your yacht, your whatever added together is. So in the south of England, that's more than 13%, and in Scotland, it's less than 7% of households are in that category. So that kind of shows you the reality between Scotland's income generation and the amount that comes back to Scotland through whatever public sector spending or other mechanisms. And just to touch on this one, because we talked about the economy and we talked about the social impact of that. This is a map of average male life expectancy at birth across the UK. The darker the colour, the lower the life expectancy. There's actually some areas of dark green in there that you can't see because they're so small, which have got the highest life expectancy in the UK, which is Chelsea, Kensington and Westminster. So no surprise there. So yeah, so the whole point being that there's a very close, it's not just about the money, there's a very close correlation between health outcomes and wealth, which is kind of starkly shown there. So, right, moving on. The broad shoulders, as was talked about, the broad shoulders of the UK that we can all rely on to look after us. We've looked at debt and deficit, and the UK is not wonderful position there. This is the balance of payments, which is what I kind of touched on earlier. The UK balance of payments, difference between our imports and our exports. The UK as a country imports significantly more than it exports, and has done for a very long time. And I remember back 30 years ago, we'd talk about the balance of payments was a big deal. With a negative balance of payments, people used to get worried about it. We stopped worrying about it somewhere about 20 years ago, and nobody really talks about it very much now. But basically, it's an important indicator of how well you're trading in the world. And the only thing that keeps the UK balance of payments kind of from being completely through the floor is Scottish exports and the City of London financial sector, which has got a lot of cash kind of running through it. And if you think about it, it's a sector that relies on, well, what does it rely on? I'm not quite sure. It's kind of folk trading in the City of London that have got other people's money that they're kind of dealing in. So that's a big part of the positive side of that. And in terms of the real economy, a big part of it is Scottish exports. So that's not great. There's some graphs of other countries' balance of payments. I was picked at random. Denmark, Germany, Sweden, who are all kind of clustered there, about the plus 5% number. And the one at the top is Norway. There's no surprise there. So compared to some countries in Europe, other comparable countries, the UK balance of payments is not very clever. So when we talk about broad shoulders, both in terms of balance of payments in the UK and in terms of the debt and the deficit, being big doesn't mean you're necessarily healthy. And I put this one in because it's close to my heart. It's deindustrialisation. It's a percentage of the economy and manufacturing over the last 40 years. So back to 1970, a whole cluster of European countries had manufacturing sectors 25 to 30% of their total economy. Some of us can remember some of that. The line that goes right to the floor at 10% or less is the UK. So we've deindustrialised at a faster rate than most other European countries. So all that goes to show that the UK isn't as strong as they would have you believe. So in summary, the austerity model is broken. It doesn't work. It doesn't work from an economic point of view. The economic theory says it shouldn't work. The data shows you that it doesn't work, and the social consequences of it are not very clever either. The UK is not in a great place when it comes to a number of key economic indicators. The UK economy is unbalanced, and you look at the structure in that manufacturing sector kind of emphasises that, and it's unfair. But there are alternatives there that can work, and bizarrely it's Scotland that's kind of showing the rest of the UK the way on how that different economic policy could be coherently implemented. So we talk about the politics of this, what's going to happen. Well, there's two parts to this. There's a part, the away leg, if you like, what happens at Westminster, which is all about two things. It's about bringing home Smith, plus a lot more than that, hopefully, giving the Scottish Government the powers to do more of the economic activity that we think we need to do, but also recognising the fact that there was a no vote. We are part of the UK for the foreseeable future, and that means we've got an influence on what happens in the UK. So the second part of what we need to do is to direct UK government policy away from failed austerity and towards something that makes more sense, not just for Scotland, but for the UK as a whole. And the second part then, of course, is the home leg, what happens in Holyrood going forward over the next number of years. That's about taking those new powers that come back here and implementing them in a clever, coherent way that makes a difference to people's lives and gets the economy moving again in Scotland. Creating a confidence that as a nation we're able to deal with those extra powers as we get more and more of the economic tools, and building the infrastructure in the country, because there's a lot of things, frankly, we can do between now and any future independence event in terms of building our political institutions, our social institutions, our infrastructure in terms of physical infrastructure and organisational infrastructure, so that using those new powers to do that, so that the final step is a smaller one when we eventually get there. I'm going to run through some key sectors now just to kind of highlight some of this, and I've picked 10. I'm going to kind of whiz through them to give you a sense of the breadth of what we've got here in terms of Scotland's economy. The first one, obviously, oil and gas. How much oil and gas is left? Well, 50 years, 100 years, who knows, but it's certainly a lot more than some of the numbers that were floated about during the referendum. But you've got to remember, it's not just oil and gas, the extraction. There's other parts to that. The oil and gas services is a big and growing part of that sector, as is the equipment that comes in the back of that, because a lot of the oil companies' support services, it's now all about people that have worked in the industry for a long number of years, have got very high levels of skills, plus the technology that's been developed in the deep water drilling. And you get on a flight from Aberdeen, there's Scottish guys flying all over the world to support oil sectors in whatever corner of the globe. And that's all revenue coming back to Scotland. Food and drink, of course, is huge. Whisky and premium foods, and well positioned as premium brands. If you think about Scottish food exports, they're all kind of premium brands, be it salmon, be it other fisheries, be it beef, be it whatever, which is nice because you command, you don't have a big industry, but you do command a premium price for it, which is important. Renewables is potentially huge because of the geography we've got. There's 25% of the potential wave power in Europe is in Scotland. If you look at the map, the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea empty in and out of each other twice a day, regular as clockwork, and that's a huge amount of potential energy. So we're in a position where we can exploit that. And that leads on to a lot of manufacturing sectors on the back of that if we do that properly. I mean, Denmark's a country that's invested in that sector for the long term. Another country of 5 million people with a lot less natural resources than us. They've recognised that as a sector and pumped a lot of investment into that. That's something that we should be doing as well. Marine's another one. We talk about Scottish shipbuilding, and we talked during the referendum about Scottish military shipyards could close if there was a yes vote and all these other scare stories, forgetting the fact that the number of people employed in shipbuilding in Scotland under the Union went from 35,000 to just a few thousand. So the Union was so good it would have protected those shipbuilding jobs. And Norway's an interesting example. They built closer to 100 ships in Norway last year across 30 odd shipyards. And the average wage in Norway is more than twice what it is in Scotland, and they export those ships. So it just shows you what you can do with a much higher cost base than us if you focus on the right markets in the right sectors and the right kind of ships and doing the right kind of outfitting for them. The Norwegians have built up a nice wee business there just by doing things that make sense, and there's no reason why we couldn't do that. Life sciences, another area. I was actually, by coincidence, out in Rosslyn, which is the Edinburgh University Vet School, and they've got a kind of science park there that they're developing, which is where they did Dolly the sheep and all this kind of stuff. And that's a sector that's, that whole life sciences, research and development and all the healthcare stuff that comes off the back of it is a sector that's grown in Scotland, where we're quite well placed from an academic point of view and to build on top of that. Tourism, huge. The whole Brand Scotland thing is world renowned. You go anywhere in the world, people know about Scotland and what it stands for. And from a tourism point of view, it's a huge advantage compared to most countries. Professional services is one of the areas I've been involved in. Exporting expertise, we talked about that in the oil and gas sector. But across a whole range of sectors, there's people in Scotland with decades of expertise that we export, which is a very big earner for us. Financial services, people talk about the crash, but financial services, well-managed asset management, which is looking after people's money, investing it wisely and knowing how to do that, is something that Scotland's been very strong in and continues to be strong in. And that part of the financial services market, rather than the let's invest in stuff that doesn't really exist part of it, which kind of crashed, but the asset management part of it is fairly strong. Manufacturing we talked about, but that's all about recovering from the downturn we've had and reindustrialising. And that's something that takes time, but it's something that can absolutely be done. And I talk about Finland, where I lived and worked for a year, got a percentage of manufacturing in their economy twice what we have, a country of 5 million people. Very little natural resources apart from some forestry. No fisheries like we've got, no oil and gas like we've got. And they've had some horrendous times over the past few decades. Our biggest market was the Soviet Union, which obviously collapsed in the early 90s. And what they did was they said, well, okay, what's the up-and-coming sectors? Telecoms in the early 90s, that looks like a good sector. Let us go and build a world-beating telecoms company from scratch. And they went and did it with Nokia. So it just shows you what you can do if you go and focus on stuff. And there's a huge amount of industry in Finland, which is spread right across the country from north to south, and all kinds of small towns. You stumble across factories employing 300 or 400 people building stuff, which is just incredible. And a lot of that was off the back of the supply chain they built to support Nokia and the telecom sector. And not forgetting Scottish universities, which of course are right up there amongst the best in the world. So if you run through it, there's an awful lot of economic strengths we've got. I talk about connectivity, and this kind of puts some numbers round about the potential and the difference between having an economy that's focused on being an independent country of 5 million people, where you've got people want to come and do business with you because you've got head offices there and you've got government to government business going on, government to business stuff going on, and also a focus on connectivity that isn't completely centred around how many runways we should have at Heathrow, and spreading that air traffic about a bit. Denmark, Norway, Scotland, all about 5 million people, and the main airports in Copenhagen and Oslo putting through significantly more traffic than Edinburgh. Yeah, Glasgow into the picture, it's still significantly more traffic than the combined traffic there. So the potential for growth, in just one example, connectivity is huge if we're managing that properly. From a tax point of view, from an investment point of view, and from a Brand Scotland, if you like, point of view. So, Scottish Government brought out their strategy for growth, as it happens, just in the last few days, which focuses on export growth, which is key for a country of 5 million people, but we're well placed to do that. Encouraging innovation, again, if you're a relatively high-waged economy compared to the Asian economies, for example, you need to position yourself in a place where you're working on high-value add, high-wage, high-technology sectors. And that's all about innovation and investment, which is very, very important, which is what the Scandinavians have done very successfully. Investment driven, we talked about, and also understanding social inclusion is a big, big part of that. Using economic powers to target support. moving away from the blanket 3% corporation tax to something that's more about, okay, what sectors have got the potential for export growth, let's target tax breaks there, what sectors are investing money in other ways, let's target some support there, which is much more focused and I think quite coherent. And as I said, underpinned by a strong academic sector. So, I want to talk about, just to finish up, we're all right for time, are we? Yeah, okay. My wee story from Norway. Apologies if you've heard this before, and apologies if I can't remember it all, because it's 6 months since I've told it. But it's a wee story about the Prime Minister of Norway that goes for a walk along the fjord one day, as you do, and he stumbles across the magic lamp, and he picks up and gives it a rub, and the genie pops out, and the genie says to him, "I'll give you some wishes to make Norway a better country." And the Prime Minister says, "Well, I can't really think of anything because we're just about the richest country in the world. They measure these things and tell us we're one of the happiest countries in the world. We've not got much poverty to speak of. Everybody's got a decent enough job and they've got plenty of leisure time and money to enjoy it. So it's kind of hard to think of something that would make us a better place." And he says, "Well, you need to think of something." And the Prime Minister thinks for a minute and says, "Okay, I can think of a few things." He says, "Okay, on you go." He says, "Well, we've got a fairly strong economy in Norway, but it's very narrow. We've got our oil and gas, we've got some fisheries, but that's pretty much it. It'd be good if we had some other sectors that we could rely on to give us some revenue now and into the future. For example, we've got this national drink called Aquavit that we love it, but nobody else has ever heard of it. It'd be great if that was a world-renowned brand and people from Singapore to Chicago would pay stupid money to take this stuff off our hands, and we couldn't make enough of this stuff, and we were the only people that were allowed to make it. That would be a nice wee earner we could rely on into the future." He says, "Yeah, we can do that for you." He says, "We've got a problem with the language. We speak Norwegian, and nobody else in the world speaks Norwegian. It'd be great if Norwegian was a world business language. Make life a lot easier for us. Just get on a plane from here to Japan or Brazil and get off the plane and start talking Norwegian and doing business with people. That'd be nice and easy. Or go on holiday to wherever and just speak Norwegian and everybody would understand. That'd be nice." He says, "Yeah, we can do that for you." He said, "We've got a beautiful country here in Norway, but it's difficult to get around. Infrastructure's expensive, and it's a big country, a lot of mountains. The weather's horrible. In the winter, it's -35 for month after month. The snow's up to here. We've got the snow ploughs out in the morning just to get to work. It'd be great with the same natural resources and the same population in a country, a quarter the size, and a nice temperate climate all the year round, so we didn't have to worry about the snowplows digging us out every morning." He said, "Yeah, we can do that for you as well." He said, "We've got a problem getting to our main markets. To export stuff, we've got to go through 2 other countries to get to our main markets in Europe. It'd be great if we had a landmass of maybe 60 million people just bolted onto our southern border there that we could export to. And they'd all speak Norwegian, of course, and have a big world capital city there that was a real hub for investment in the economy, and we could trade with them. We wouldn't want to be ruled by them, you understand. We just want them as friendly neighbours to do business with. That would make life a wee bit easier for us. It'd be great if we had 4 of the top 200 universities in the world in Norway. That'd help. It'd be great if we had an industrial heritage going back 200 years, and when our engineers and businessmen went to talk to people, they treated us with respect because of the things we'd invented over the decades and the centuries. And it'd be great if we had a stronger brand in Norway, so that when we talked to people, they knew who we were and where we were coming from. If our national Norwegian poet, for example, was celebrated every year in Moscow and Washington, and our national dress was instantly recognised, that'd make our brand a bit stronger, help our tourism, help with our profile, and on and on and on and on and on. And the whole point is, during the referendum, we used to get laughed at by the No campaign, because we'd talk about one day Scotland could be as rich as Norway. And you've got to remember, in the 1970s, Norway was poorer than Scotland, and they get played a couple of cards, and they played them very well, and they are where they are. And we should be looking at Norway as being a kind of starting point, not an aspiration, because we've got the potential to do a lot better even than they had. And during my world tour of Scotland, I told that story a couple of times, and in the Q&A, somebody put their hand up and said, I'm from Norway. And I thought, oh my God, they're going to call me out. And on both occasions, they said, no, you're absolutely right. It's, Norway was bankrupt in the 70s, but we've done well because of what we've had, and Scotland's very, very well placed to do better than that. And just the last point, this is from the Independent newspaper, called The Independent. We're not a great fan of independence, as we know. And this was a journalist wrote this early part of last year. And what he did was he looked at some data, did some analysis on what made countries successful around the world from an empirical point of view. And he reckoned there were 3 factors that made country successful. Countries of 5 million people, give or take, were successful because they're coherent, they're more responsive to the population. It's easier to get hold of the politicians. It's the connections between politicians and business and academic sector are closer and tighter. And those size of economies are more able to take advantage of of opportunities and better able to deal with downturns. And you look at countries like that, Finland we've talked about, Sweden we've talked about, Denmark, Austria, countries like that are right at the top of the European League table. Or there were countries that are a strong financial sector. And there's been a financial crash for sure, but at the end of the day, having a strong financial sector is better to have it than not to have it. And the countries that have got those kind of sectors have managed the downturn better than most. For example, Switzerland's done all right. Singapore's doing a lot better than most of its neighbours. With their strong financial sectors, again, countries of about 5 million people. Or they've got a lot of natural resources. For example, Norway, with its natural resources and its 5 million people. So those 3 factors, the size, the natural resources and your strong financial sector. And a lot of countries that are very successful have got 2 of the 3. And the guy reckons there's only one country in the world that's got all 3, and that's Scotland. And on that basis, you reckon there was a huge potential there to do very, very well. So I'm going to leave you there, and I think we've got time for Q&A. And I hope that wasn't too wide-ranging and too diverse, and hopefully it's giving you some food for thought. So thanks very much. Thanks.